I think the biggest thing that Americans have to realize is that the Mexicans have not forgotten this. And so if we think that we are being friendly, hospitable, generous in dealing with the Mexicans these days and find that they have some reserve because they're very conscious of history, I think an understanding of the Mexican War will let us understand better how they feel about it.
Pienso dejar como reflexión final.
I would like to leave as a final reflection the only benefit we had from this shocking experience. Of course, it was a painful mutilation of our territory, but in exchange, very expensively for sure, we found a spirit of Mexican identity.
On the 4th of July, 1848, U.S. veterans of the war with Mexico marched proudly on parade in their nation's capital. Later that same day, the countersigned Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo arrived from Mexico City. James K. Polk had proved a man of his word. The goals he had set before the Congress and the nation early in his term had been fulfilled.
Monday, August 14th, 1848. I am heartily rejoiced that the session of Congress is over. My long confinement and great labor has exhausted me, and I feel the absolute necessity of having a rest.
Polk had hoped that his success would benefit his beloved Democratic Party, but his reward proved bitter. On Inauguration Day in 1849, he watched as his political rival, Zachary Taylor, the victor of Monterrey and Buena Vista, was sworn in as the 12th President of the United States. Exhausted, Polk returned to his home in Tennessee. 3 months later, he was dead. Although defeated in battle and forced into exile, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna would be called to the presidency of his country yet again in 1853. 2 years later, he was back in exile, not to return to Mexico for nearly 20 years.
I have drunk the cup of bitterness drop by drop. Nevertheless, I shall congratulate with the greatest pleasure the fortunate countryman who brings peace to our native land.
Santa Anna lived out his remaining years in obscurity, without the wealth and fame he had so eagerly sought in his youth. In the end, all that remained was the loyalty of his wife, Doña Dolores Tosta de Santa Anna.
Paga a gente del pueblo para que se acerque al balcón de la casa.
She pays the people of the town to gather around the balcony of his house and shout, "Viva Santa Anna!"
Santana sale
And Santa Anna would step out onto the balcony to thank the adoring public.
Si no sintiéndose que es,
If he didn't feel he was once again president, he could feel that it was once again possible.
esa fue.
That was his fundamental reason for living.
In the fall of 1848, Guillermo Prieto and the other writers of Apuntes, Notes for the History of the War between the United States and Mexico, published their work.
Para México, perdimos el territorio,
For Mexico, we lost the territory.
pero la experiencia de ser invadidos
But the experience of being invaded
los elementos
gave us Mexicans the necessary elements
para pensar y recomponer
to rethink, to recreate our
nuestro
country
país,
and consolidate our nation.
nuestra nación.
In the years following the war with the United States, Mexico would continue to struggle with political division, civil war, and foreign intervention. But in 1867, in the aftermath of the War of the Reform, President Benito Juarez was able to unite Mexico and defeat a French invasion of the country. Unlike the divided republic that had confronted the United States, Mexico had become a stronger nation. Even so, the North American invasion would never be forgotten. In the United States, many Americans had become convinced that theirs was a republic for the ages, a model for the rest of the world to follow. But the United States' sudden expansion inflamed an issue that had haunted the nation since birth. Would these lands be slave or free? It was a question that would drive the republic into civil war. When Generals Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant finally shook hands at Appomattox in 1865, they sought to ease the moment with talk of their experience in Mexico 18 years earlier. Near the end of his life, a disillusioned Ulysses Grant would write of the war with Mexico.
I regard the war as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation.
There were others who shared Grant's opinion that the United States had been at fault.
And if not at fault, that it did not fully live up to its ideology as expressed in the noblest of the American writings on democracy and freedom. This was an aggressive war in which we attacked a neighbor. And however much we may have won from the war, we do not like to look at the way in which we won it.
The lands taken from Mexico would become an important source of wealth for a growing United States. The discovery of gold in California spurred a great westward migration of entrepreneurs and settlers seeking new opportunities. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, more than 75,000 Mexicans chose to remain on land which had now become part of the United States. Most would become U.S. citizens, but many would lose the land on which their families had lived for generations. In California, even the wealthy Mariano Vallejo was unable to retain his place in the new order. In what many believed was a violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Vallejo was required to prove the validity of his land grants from Mexico. The legal battle forced him to sell much of his property to pay lawyers. In the end, he lost the rest to Yankee mortgage holders. The wheel of fortune is very fickle, Vallejo would write. It hit me among the first. At the time of his death in 1890, all that remained of his once vast estate was 228 acres, 2 horses, and a cow. In 1947, Harry Truman became the first U.S. president to ever visit Mexico City.
Unexpectedly, Mr. Truman makes an out-of-the-way stop at the Chapultepec Monument. Here he pays a simple tribute to the memory of Mexican youths who died 100 years ago defending their nation's capital against an American army. All Mexico was tremendously moved by this act.
Truman brought to Mexico a promise.
To observe the doctrine of non-intervention. What it means is that a strong nation does not have the right to impose its will by reason of its strength upon a weaker nation.
The sooner we Mexicans confront how we have been in the presence of the United States, the better we'll be able to relate to the North Americans. Enough of myths that we are the victims of imperialism. Yes, certainly we were, and we were many other things as well. Our conditions in Mexico helped the United States and enabled it to do what it did, and to some degree, what it is doing even today. So for me, it seems that the war is a very important example of what Mexicans should recognize about how we were, what enormous problems we faced in such a critical time as the war, because it is absolutely necessary that we demystify our relations with the United States at a time when we are resolving new boundaries in terms of geopolitics, culture, and economics.
And I think that war, studying that war, it will help for a better future for those two countries that cannot change geography. They have to live together.